So session 2, how to identify and build bankable projects. Investors, project developers, and governments convene to clarify needs and expectations. I'm going to welcome the moderator, Dr. Guillaume Sainteny. He's the president of GS Conseil and member of the scientific committee of the Monaco Prince Albert II Foundation. Guillaume, over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all of you for this last panel before lunch. So I think everybody wants to eat some things, but you still have to work a bit before. So I'm very happy to be there and to be the moderator of this panel, which is on a very difficult subject, in fact, because how to identify and build bankable project, it's really the heart of the problem, I think, in this moment, because we all know that we need much more money to come into the area of climate change, and would it be mitigation or adaptation? And it's even maybe worse for adaptation, more difficult. The government which are pushing that, I have an experience before in government, and I can say that it's difficult for government. Sometimes governments say, okay, they say to private people, okay, tell us where it's difficult for you to have a positive return, and where we could exactly help and to which quantity. And sometimes it's very difficult to have answer to that. But I guess that from the private sector, it's also difficult to have answer from the state to know how they could help. So for this topic, you will be all participants. You could ask a lot of questions, but we have first on my left, Katharina Schneider-Ross, which is CEO of Global Infrastructure Basel. I think she will present better her structure than I will do, but I think her structure is really original and interesting. Then we have Ryan Duffy, which is from Canada, and which is in Blackstone Energy Service, which is a company trying to reduce risk, mainly in North America. And of course, in the risk, there are environmental risks, not only climate change, but also other environmental risks. And finally, we have Katya Eisenbrenner, which is director at Ecofys. And maybe we could start with her. I just want to add that, as you could notice, we respect much more the gender parity than the previous panel, since we are 50-50. Please, Katya.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Katya Spang. I'm a director at Ecofys, the Navigant company. As some of you may have heard of us, we are around actually for 30 years and for a long time, and also in the climate discussions. Since last year, we joined with Navigant. It's a large US company also working in consulting, and we're now covering, and I'm really excited about that, the whole spectrum really from planning energy, working with utilities, all the way to actually working in developing countries, working on projects. I will tell a little bit more about that. And also we're working in the analyzing actually where do we stand today with the Climate Action Tracker. We are looking at where do we stand with the NDCs, what progress is made. And actually I want to start actually with today. Should we stop here or go into a bit more?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I will share a little bit about my experience before I started working with Ecofys, because what we see these days, we're talking about climate, but I worked with the Forest Stewardship Council before, and we were just talking about that actually there needs to be more linkages between climate and forestry and other of these elements. And what struck me at working there with the FSC, the combination of already working with a social chamber and an environmental chamber and a private sector chamber, and these three dimensions are really needed when we're talking about building projects that are financiable, talking to the different stakeholders, which I think is a key factor to consider. And looking at this now, and we'll hear a little bit more about some other standards that are currently in development, the good news was that with these standards, the level playing field increased. So there was maybe thought at the beginning, maybe we need a price premium. What is that? Is it going to work? Really having a standard for forestry, but it did work. It still exists. It is growing, and there's more opportunities for us to connect from the climate world with other outside worlds than climate. And I will leave it here for the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. You can now, Ryan, could you elaborate a bit on what you do and the relation with that, and we will come back to you after.
Sure. Thank you very much, and thank you for opening up the opportunity here to speak about what it is that Blackstone is doing. I can't see everybody in the audience, but does anybody on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, this is a question out to the crowd that I can't see, do you check your utility invoice every month, understand what's on that utility invoice for your home? I don't see any hands. I don't know if that's because I can't see. A couple maybe. And so I guess if you are not doing that, then certainly when your bill comes in, the amount is always a surprise, right? The reason why you're probably in that position, it's not a bad position to be in, it's because that home bill is actually not a lot of money in the grand scheme of your annual income. So it's likely from all averages, even though we're talking about a number of different countries here, it's probably less than 0.5% of your after-tax income. We manage energy bills for industrial, cities, hospitals, even commercial buildings. And on average, our clients are spending $1 million a month in their utilities and their energy costs. So our job is to help them de-risk those expenditures and give them a little bit of insight and foresight as to why there might be change coming. And certainly climate change is one, whether it be unexpected changes or expected policy changes. Our head office is in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and Ontario has a cap and trade program that was just recently kicked off. And the impact to our clients is 10% of their natural gas costs have gone up. So it's a pretty big deal. It's a material amount. So we saw it coming. We've been an active participant at COP for a few years. We've been in the energy efficiency space. Even though the company started in 2003, we got into more energy efficiency in around 2009. But we're here to help them sort of manage that. We look at energy markets, we look at risk around financing and policy markets. So I'll leave it there for now.
I was wondering, did you assess also risk of coming from the climate change to ecosystems? I mean, for example, in some sectors, ecosystem services are more important than in others. It would be tourism or agriculture or forestry. Mm-hmm. Are you able to assess that? I mean, the reducing of the quantity of ecosystem services delivered by ecosystems because of climate change?
We don't. Our focus is on anybody that's spending a lot of money on energy. So, okay. Like I said, like a hospital is sort of part of the ecosystem. And certainly we do a lot of work with them around resiliency, not from a sustainability perspective of being greener. It's more like backup power.
It could be, for example, the change of quantity of water for hydroelectricity, you know?
Yep.
It could be not exactly in the same place or drier in summer or something like that.
Yep. We're certainly involved in what's happening and where there's constraints on the systems, but it's more taking that risk and sort of interpreting it and putting it into perspective for our clients.
Okay.
Yeah.
Katharina, do you want to explain exactly, because you are in a big project which is trying to build a kind of standard. So I think you need to take some time to well explain in details because it's a new thing.
Thank you. I'm from Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation, and as you said, we have been developing a standard which is called SURE, the Standard for Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure. It's here, as it was released 3 days ago. But let me take you back to the history of our foundation, maybe. We started out with a series of events, which we call the GIP Summits, where we tried to introduce sustainable infrastructure projects to investors. So we did that with a former tool we used, which is called the GIP grading, and selected 30 to 40 projects a year, and then did a matchmaking event every year with investors. And we were very unsuccessful by doing that, as we did not understand exactly at that moment, which was 6 years ago, this whole bankability question we are having on this panel today. As we worked with this all together at the end, about 100 projects, we understood that that is the major question. Some projects are not bankable. And I have to say this here because everyone is striving for this bankability. And I think we really have to understand some projects do create a revenue, some don't. And we have to deal with that question and that's what we try to do then in this process, to also give some guidance to projects. So we had like up to 180 submissions every year at the end to give some guidance to which projects should be presented to private investors and which should not, or should go another path. And there's grant funding, there's other underfunded aspects of that. And what we learned, understanding the private side, private investor side of things, was that self-assessment tool is not enough. There's a need for a third-party certified standard, which really guarantees with a strong assurance system in the back that a project is complying with a set of sustainability and resilience criteria. So how did we define those? You could say, oh, you're just a small non-profit out of Switzerland, and we're covering criteria from governance, environment, and society criteria. So we are not the expert in all of these aspects. So we made sure we had a very strong governance structure. We are leading the secretariat together with Natixis Investment Bank. And there's a stakeholder council with about up to 40 institutions and a standard committee. And we tried to balance the stakeholders very well. They're regionally balanced. So we have participants from India, China, Colombia, South Africa, very broad. But also the backgrounds and expertise of these stakeholders are very well balanced, we think. It's the engineering associations, it's the big construction companies, it's the development banks, the World Bank is in there, the European Investment Bank, it's the UN with UN Ops and UN Habitat. So we have the city perspective with also cities having contributed to these criteria, like Tran in South Africa, or Boston or New Orleans. So we really tried, we have the WWF in there for environment and Transparency International for governance. So we really tried to have a very strong expertise, and these stakeholders were very engaged in helping us to define those criteria. And the best thing is, at the end, it was a consensus-based decision. So they all agreed on this criteria set, the 61 criteria. I want to mention my colleague here, who is sitting here, who did that actually. Lorena. Yeah, you want to stand up for a second? We are so proud of you. It was a 3-year-long process, just to.
Okay, what is the timing? I mean, when it will be fully operational for everybody to be a member of that, etc.?
It is certifiable since 3 days ago.
Okay.
Our challenge now is to really convince projects to do the certification. And we do think we have a good incentive, as these criteria also are a risk mitigation instrument.
Okay.
And what Natixis made us do, like the investment bank that we collaborated with, is also to create a parallel approach of doing risk mitigation and showing the benefit creation of a project at the same time. So that was a bit hard to balance, but we tried to our best to make sure with the certification you can see the benefit creation a project achieves and the risk mitigation aspects at the same time.
And everybody can look at that on the internet?
It's open, yeah.
Okay, can you just give the internet address for everybody?
It's www.gib, Global Infrastructure Basel, GIP Foundation.org.
Okay, I would like to ask a question to all of you on the tax issue, because of course, from the government point of view, this was one of the topics of the workshop before, but to having sometimes bankable projects, sometimes because in some projects you can have a lower rate of return, you need some tax adaptation. So in general, the states, as we know, don't want to make too much tax adaptation. First of all, to not having a too complex tax code, and then because they will get less money. So from your point of view, or you three, what would be the 2 or 3 important tax reform to do to help having bankable project when the rate of return is a bit either negative in this moment, either zero, either slightly positive?
And maybe I would, in the developing countries that we have been working with, actually tax is one element, but it's also the subsidies. I think when also before we talk about tax, it's also something to look at where are actually subsidies going. So actually reducing some of the subsidies in the energy sector, and I know there's different elements to consider in terms of social and responsibility and all doing that right, but I think that is actually where some of the projects, and that's sometimes where you say some projects are actually not bankable because they're needed and we're trying to do them against an enabling environment that actually fosters them. So I think actually we need to look at removing some of the subsidies, and that's where the government can also play a role to set the right enabling environment.
Yeah. You are talking about harmful subsidies.
Harmful subsidies, yeah.
This is it's a very interesting point. If I just may elaborate 1 or 2 minutes on that, because we have, for example, in this moment, we have each year 550 billions of dollars of subsidies to fossil fuels, which is much more than subsidies to renewable and much more than subsidies to energy efficiency. So that means we are not in the condition of the market. And sometimes, if we were in the condition of the market without subsidies for anything, the renewable, for example, would be competitive. It's obviously the case in the Middle East. In the Middle East, where is a huge part of this 550 billion of dollars, if you suppress tomorrow the subsidies to fossil fuels, renewable can be at parity, what we call at parity. That means are available in an economic way without any subsidies. The only fact that renewable are not really taking off in this part of the world is because fossil fuel are subsidized so much. So this is really, you are right, it's a big problem. OECD has been working a lot on that since a long time. IMF is also now asking for that. The World Bank also, of course, UNEP and all these kind of things. What about you? You have some subsidies in Canada for fossil fuel, I'm afraid,
Yep.
no?
Yeah, we definitely do. They're a bit of a necessary evil, I guess. We tend not to ever give a proposal to a client that is really heavily weighted around incentives or tax advantages, because most of our clients are pretty suspect of any sort of incentives or tax breaks that they get. And most of the companies that we deal with, they've got their own tax schemes going on already. And to do a tax break on a small project of $10 million doesn't really, it's more of a problem to deal with than it is as a benefit. But the necessary evil part, the tax rate, what our favorite is accelerated depreciation on the asset. And that's a pretty easy, nice, tight and tidy one to deal with. And what that does and what some of the incentives do is they help get over the initial equity side of commitment. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to ask clients to change and to invest into their facility, whether it be lighting or air handling systems or boilers or even CHP. And that is not what they do day to day. They make cookies or they make cars or they do something other than worry about the ambient temperature in their buildings. So to ask them to put capital into that is pretty foreign to them, and they're not interested in it. So a tax break or an incentive will help give a little bit of what otherwise would have been equity, so that a traditional lender, and there's tons out there that you don't need much for them to actually fund these things. I know a lot of people have talked today about the trouble with financing. We have not had trouble with financing. And it all comes down to how you de-risk it If you have other things like the SURE program to lean on, even better. A lot of our work is around the rigor, around the engineering side of it, and having everybody around the table and making sure that they understand the risks and rewards, and that's been a benefit so far.
Thank you, Katharina, on this topic.
Yeah, let me tackle that tax question from another angle. I'm also in the steering board of the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, a very long name. It was initiated by Ban Ki-moon for COP21 to strengthen the role of cities in the climate finance arena. And we had a long half-day working session yesterday with project preparation facility practitioners. And in that sense, that we think we can accelerate climate finance if cities play a stronger role. But how can cities play a stronger role? It's if there's a certain way of decentralization, and some cities do not have strong access to tax money because it's taken on the national level. So I think that's also an aspect we could think about, or which could accelerate climate finance, is if cities do have stronger access to tax money, which they actually can directly use for projects, because we do believe they know best. They are really on the ground, and they can take very fast decisions, or as fast as it can be on climate action.
Okay, let me ask you, the three of you, another question, which is, I think, a problem. Well, at least from my point of view. I think it's much more easy to find bankable projects in the field of mitigation than in the field of adaptation. This is a problem. Why? Because as we all know, a part of the climate change is already there. And even if we stop tomorrow, at the end of the year, the greenhouse gas emission, the climate change will still go on during years and years. So in some countries, which will be much more impacted than, for example, Europe, in the south countries, we will need a lot of adaptation, even if we still need to finance mitigation. So how is it possible to design more bankable projects in the field of adaptation, or is it possible to transfer some finance going to mitigation to adaptation? I will take only one example. In France, we have an agency for helping developing countries to finance some projects. It's named Agence Française de Développement, French Agency for Development. When you look at how they finance the things, 20 years ago, there were almost no financing any climate project. Now there are, some 50% of their engagement are connected with climate change, which is a big move and a big change. But more than 2/3 are for mitigation, and less than 1/3 is for adaptation. And when you look at the country where they give the land money, they are mainly French-speaking African countries, and some other English African countries, Asiatic countries, a bit of Latin America, etc. The big majority of these countries are emitting very few greenhouse gas. For example, I think the whole Africa is something like 2 or 3% of the world in this moment, even if it's going to grow up. And so the need for mitigation there is not obvious if you compare with other countries, whether the need for adaptation is enormous. So we have a big problem. So and when you talk about that with them, they say, okay, but don't forget that we are banks. We are a public bank, of course, but we are a bank. And for us, it's much more easy to find a mitigation project having a very low rate of return, but at least having a rate of return, whether for adaptation, the business case is not there. Would you have some idea to help them, for example, or others?
I think in the relation to adaptation is also defining on what you define an adaptation project and how much is actually any project that you do need to look at how it will link to adaptation. So if you're looking at the infrastructure, and Katharina will know there, it needs to be integrated. And there is actually also with the development banks that we're talking to and with the communities is how much of a project, or like should you not, because it's the environment is changing around you, so you need to adapt independently of like calling it an adaptation project, but you need to do it actually for your own own, like to mitigate the risk, actually to be resilient with the project. So it's a question of, do we really need to design adaptation project as such? While for mitigation, that was in the definition a little bit easier. You reduce emissions, and by that you have defined, okay, there's a specific need, you account that to a certain value, which in adaptation is also still in the discussion. And I know in the UNFCCC debate, the whole topic about what is called there now transparency has over the past years really increased attention. I was in a discussion in May with some of the key negotiators, and there's questions still on how would you define the indicators for adaptation, and how would you do that? I think actually there's more work needed. If we now link that back to making the projects bankable that are purely on adaptation, I think we have to see how to do it. I would be happy to hear what my colleagues will say, but I would not have this is the one answer, but we need to integrate it in the more structured approach.
Yeah, I think adaptation has got a different time horizon than mitigation, so it's a good point to bring up for sure. It also has a different risk as it relates to financing as well too. For mitigation projects, we've been able to take clients out successfully 20-year terms with interest rates below 5% for not very large projects, under $5 million, under $3 million. So there's certainly a mindset that needs to be changed there. I spent a lot of time this last summer in China, working with a number of energy companies there and trying to understand China, the largest corporation in the world, but also trying to understand their mindset and their view on energy, because they are a big consumer, and we always talk about the demand, but just to try to understand how they feel about the demand. And they really do care about climate change. And it was evident when we were told about their 300-year business plan. And I'm an entrepreneur. I've got a really good business plan. It's not 300 years. I don't think anybody in here has a 300-year business plan. But to look that far out, you're going to make different investments. And getting back to maybe the tax side of things, or the role of the government, or the role of the World Banks, on those adaptation projects, if they could still be the seed equity, the seed portion of that project to encourage other sources of money to come in, I think you'll find that the funds will be available. And again, it's sort of, the 300-year business plan is really neat. It's also, we can't forget that we are in a warlike state as it relates to addressing climate change. And we don't see and hear the bombs going out outside of the building here, but it is real, and we need to change our mindset in order to properly address it. So, and adaptation is key. I'll add one more in, because we touch all these parts, is technology. So the only way we believe that we're going to get stay below 2 degrees is with the assistance of technology. We made a pact to our clients, and that we want to take more than 50% of our clients to net zero by 2032. The significance around 2032 seems like an odd number. It was 15 years out, and at the time that we made that announcement, we had been around for 15 years, so it was kind of the next chapter. And we've already got tons of clients that have signed up to have that goal in mind. There's no silver bullet. It's a bit of a come on the bus and we'll get you there kind of a scenario. But technology for some of the stuff I'm exposed to on the X Prize and some of the other folks that we hang out with in Silicon Valley, technology is changing way too fast. So adaptability is you need to be nimble. And this is where this concept of energy as a service has come up, so that people don't want to own the asset, they would just rather rent it. And when the latest version comes up, your service provider will swap that out. We've circling back to bankability, hopefully I'm not going all over the place for people. Technology has also been a stumbling block for investors in the past because they don't want to invest in Star Trek type of products. They need to be proven, they need to be bankable. And one thing that we're seeing now is the testing of new products because of technology, on technology, is going like rapid fire. So you can put a product through the same kind of rigor of testing. A decade ago would have taken you a couple of years, and you can do it in a couple months. So you were able to produce more solutions, and I think that's the exponential change that we're going to see in how technology is going to help everything, including the adaptation side.
Katharina?
I strongly agree with Katja. What we tried to do with the standard was to combine adaptation and mitigation measures into one standard. So for us, every project has to have resilience measures in place, has to have a resilience management system, and has to be prepared for climate change. At the same time, we make sure the project mitigates. So there are criteria on GHG emissions, on resource management. So we tried to combine both. It was very hard to do that sometimes. There's sometimes a conflict. But after all these negotiations we think we found a good way to do that. And I really also agree let's put it like that, with the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, we did a State of Climate Finance report 2 years ago, where it was really also hard to identify the exact adaptation funding and mitigation funding of the development banks we analyzed. So I also think that there needs to be more of an alignment, but I also have not the solution to it, but I do think every project should be prepared. The other thing we are working with a lot is nature-based solutions. We are in a consortium that creates the biggest platform for nature-based solutions in Europe with the European Commission, and we work a lot there with trying to define business cases for nature-based solutions, which is very often strongly interlinked with adaptation measures. So this is, I think, another topic I always want to bring in, because I think there's so much potential in there. And the challenge there is to always to be able to identify the beneficiaries of a certain measure, and then be able to identify who should actually pay for it. I think this is the hardest challenge with nature-based solutions out there, or what we have experienced with gathering all these information on business cases for nature-based solutions also in combination with adaptation.
Maybe a last question before turning to the audience. It is more and more acknowledged that we have talked about that at the very beginning, that we need to have a stronger relationship between biodiversity and climate change issue. And then sometimes it's strengthening the ecosystem existing that is one of the best and less costly way of mitigating the effect of climate change. Obviously, in country where there is a very important natural capital, like southern country in general. I think it was one of the step forward of the Paris Agreement, which has recognized that in the agreement, with the concept of nature-based solution, which is now very well pushed by IUCN, for example. There was one thing which was very interesting in the 90s, or even from the end of the 80s, I think. It was the concept of debt for nature swap. I don't know if you are all familiar with that. The idea was to cancel or to moderate a part of the external debt of a developing country, which was by either banks, either governments, either NGO, etc., in exchange of will it be, it has been made a lot for biodiversity conservation, but also access to fresh water, or now it can be done for climate project. How could you see some biodiversity strengthening project being able to be bankable? Because as you know, and as we know, in biodiversity, it's more difficult to have bankable project. And the second part of the question, will this debt for nature swap could be revitalized by the climate environment? If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think I see what you mean. I think with these concepts, we have had many of these concepts. So the one thing what I like about what you said, it came up in the 80s, there may be some experience. So because I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel, I don't know all the details of it. It sounds like there is some opportunity in it, at least to look at it, how it could be used for climate. However, we have to consider that, as also Katharina said, not every project is then for everything is a market or everything needs to be traded. So I think what we then should also smartly do as a community overall, which goes back to the equity discussion and all of that, but how do we invest in which projects we put the grant money, in which projects do we put some of the other financing instruments to actually then really use the strengths of the different players, like the development banks and like what you're doing, and then to come up with the best value for where the investment goes, and then doing the right de-risking, bringing the private sector in where it can go, and then leaving maybe some of these projects also for those who actually want to, like philanthropical, or say just here, this is something where we want to support something where there's not a market.
It's a good question. This is the first time we heard the question, just in case you were wondering out there. These aren't prepped. We don't have a lot of experience in that side of it. I think it's because a lot of our clients default back to what Mr. Picard said at the very beginning, for those of you that saw his opening speech there, and that is people change because of profit or policy. All of our clients, for the most part, are for profit. So if there is some low-hanging fruit and some ability to save money, they're going to do that first, for sure. So if I'm going to dovetail that back to your question, I think when we look at the energy efficiency work that we're doing and we look at the renewable work that we're doing, it's a bit of a bridge to get to maybe where you're talking. And again, if I weave in technology there, the bio and material science changes that are happening at exponential pace as well too will also assist with merging the bio and into everything that we do. That's my opinion.
Katharina?
From our perspective, this is also...
Switzerland has spent a lot of debt for nature swap some years ago, yeah.
Yeah, very strong on biodiversity topics too. I'm not Swiss, by the way.
Okay.
No. I mean, from our perspective, we are always working on the project level. And we are trying to combine a lot of aspects, and one is biodiversity, obviously. Now it's very strongly featured in the standard, and I do believe that we have to interconnect these dialogues, the climate, biodiversity, social, what's called co-benefits. From our perspective, I know the official wording is like climate and co-benefits, but from our perspective, we have 61 criteria. They all are equally important. Some are more important because they're called red criteria, but it's too technical. But they cover society, governance, and environment. So we do think, I do believe that the biodiversity aspects should be really always taken up together with climate. And the attention is on climate at the moment, but I think we have, for us, every project has to answer questions on biodiversity. So it's a basic question project has to answer to, but it doesn't really answer your question. just to tell you about our approach.
Okay, so I think it's time to take some question from the audience. Please raise your hand and explain in some words who you are and from which institution do you speak, if I can tell it like that. And to who you direct the question if you want to ask the question specifically to one of the three of our panelists.
Thank you. Yoganandan from a cooperative company working on climate change, biodiversity, and other matters. My question is about the exchange risk and about the rate of return. Mr. Duffy mentioned 5%, but if I take a concrete case, I work on Sri Lanka, I work on solar, and the electricity which is produced would be sold in terms of rupees, even if it is the price is fixed for 20, maybe 25, 30 years at the maximum. The money that you are investing is normally in euros or dollars. So how do you manage the exchange risk? That's one question. Second question, I'm wondering whether the rate of return that you are expecting from these projects, which are, if you like, green, is it the same as the rate of return that you expect from any other project? Thank you.
So the exchange rate is like a risk, no? So maybe you could answer.
Yeah, the interest rate and certainly FX risk has to get mitigated. If you're going to do a project in Europe or you're going to do something in Barbados or the US or Canada, you need to, you would be smart to consolidate your FX. And where there is exposure, we certainly can cover that off in the markets. From a return perspective, the returns are great. And the reason why I can say it like that, if we're looking at a lot of the panels today and even at the neighboring COP have been talking about massive infrastructure, country-wide sort of, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars sort of to invest. What we're dealing with is hundreds of thousands, tens of millions. So it's a smaller amount. And when you're deploying that kind of money, you have to ideally aggregate those projects so that you can then vend those out to the life cos eventually down the road. So there's some risk around how quickly you can package those up. And the interest rates in that interim that you would that would be worn is a higher interest rate than the overall project rate that I mentioned earlier. So there is absolutely a balance there, but the returns are, we've got so many people that are, whether they're angel investors, whether they're smaller climate funds like Toronto Atmospheric Fund is one, or just traditional banks. Like we really do have a lot of transactions with traditional banks. The challenge with a traditional bank is they're not going to go any longer than 7 years. So if you've got a project that is longer than that, you need to mix your lenders. Then you get into pecking orders and things like that. But our approach is much like building a house, right? So you can pick your property. You've got the regulations that you have to deal with from a building code perspective. You've got an architect, and you've got trades, everyone that needs to be managed. And it's no different with this project. We're managing the baseline for your business case is what do you think energy prices are going to do in the future, which includes cost of carbon and mitigation and the likes. Includes cost of money. And we traditionally bring in a syndicate so that there's multiple people. It helps diversify the risk as well too, as long as they play nice together. And we come at it from an unbiased approach from an equipment solution as well too. So we don't manufacture the device that we're selling the client. We're impartial in that regard. All goes to diversifying mitigating the risk. The lenders like that. And if they're comfortable with that, they'll give you better terms and conditions. Does that help answer it?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if I'm allowed to pose a question to the moderator.
Sure.
Dr. Sainteny. Okay, thank you. Henry Rees.
Sustainable development is freedom, you know, so.
Okay, very well. So I'll be very free. Henry Rees from the French Association Énergie Franco-Allemande, but I'm German myself. To further the question which I posed this morning to the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, we've got somebody of the Fondation Prince Albert, and Prince Albert I, the grandfather of the current prince, he kind of invented ocean research 100 years ago. And as I mentioned earlier, oceans, that is 72% of the world's surface, but no lobby, no voters and so, but taking a great impact by heat, acidification and so on. And as I mentioned also earlier, in this Congress in Canada, where the Prince was also there and His Excellency Fautrier and of the Musée Océanographique, we learned that there is very little expertise in the financial field of judging. The bankers don't know if a project is good or not. So my question to you would be, and the Fondation Albert too, that is scientific committee, but do you have also economic experts who help to judge if a project is viable or not? Because apparently there's a problem in that sort of projects, you know, in algae or ocean energy. There was in Monaco in spring the Congress for Ocean Energy, the World Congress. It's about 700,000 jobs in that. But if, for example, the ocean energy roadmap of the European Union with the British moving out is going nowhere currently. Germany, for example, is not involved at all. So is there expertise in your foundation, or will you build that up?
Okay. Well, in 2 words, the Prince Albert Foundation is 10 years old. We have just celebrated the 10th birthday some months ago. It's focusing on 3 topics, which are climate change, biodiversity, and access to fresh water. And it's focusing on 3 geographical areas, which are the pole, because the pole are the Principation, and the less advanced countries and the Mediterranean area. You have talked about oceans. We focus a lot on, well, we try to focus a lot on seas and oceans. The projects are assessed by, there are, I would say, 3 steps. First, the team of the foundation, because we receive an enormous amount of projects, and of course they are not equal in quality. So there is a first selection which is made to take away the project which are not completely finished or which are clearly not serious. And then there is an exam by the scientific committee. In the scientific committee, you have people coming from very different backgrounds. You have retired civil servants, you have scientists, you have people from country very different, and you have people having an economic background. And then it's again assessed by the board, where there are more people like more older and former Ministry of Environment and this kind of thing, but you have also some former bankers or people like that. So I would answer your question like that. And another way to answer your question is to notice that because we have so much project, of course, the selection is very strict, and the economic viability of the project is going to be a key element. And personally, I look very precisely to the balance sheet and the income statement to in the years coming, and etc. Well, this is what can I say. So I see there was a question there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your new perspectives. My name is Irene Hale. I run a press agency. We report for Newsweek and Deutsche Welle, German press, Swiss press, many others. So it's big hope to see pioneers of the infrastructure world. And I just saw you're saving $180 million, right, in energy costs for your clients, right? And they all come back. So, and you have the big overview. And you're saving the oceans. So fantastic panel. So just imagine that you're Superman, And because we're in a big mess, demonstrations out there, nothing's moving, politicians are paralyzed by Trump. So we need super women and supermen. So imagine you could do anything you could do, possibly. So what would you, for musketeers to save the world and the climate? Thank you.
So there is one Superman and two Superwomen, in fact. So the Superman, since you have been quoted.
Yeah, you take a Superman. I don't mind. You want me to go first? I think that's a really cool question. I like it. Clearly, you're in media, and you've been asking some good questions the whole event here. I think if I could fly into the future and take a picture of what it looks like and bring it back to show people the reality of where we could be going and the harm that can be found, I think that would be simple and interesting without lifting up too many heavy things.
Katya?
Yeah, for me, it's showing people where they can really connect the dots. And that goes from citizens, that goes with governments, that goes with the industry, because I think we're often still working in silos. I mean, there's maybe the biodiversity, and I'm a forester myself. One silo, you have climate, you have oceans, you have plastic, you have the industry. So I think really connecting the dots between the different elements and finding the right recipe to do that, that is what I would try to do.
Katharina? As a superwoman?
I think people really have to find out what they really need for life. There's a lot of things we don't need, and we should get rid of those, because I think that's the simple question. Is it plastic? Is it infrastructure? Is it really, we should just decide to do really, to limit our footprint. I think that's a major thing. And then to make sure that the ones who are actually not responsible for that don't suffer most. But that's not a solution, that's just a hope.
Yeah. Well, personally, I will do one thing. We have been talking about that some minutes ago. I would suppress all the harmful subsidies, all the harmful public subsidies. I think it's a reform which is not costly for the economy. It would be an advantage for developing countries because they could reallocate these subsidies to health, education, things much more important for developing countries than subsidizing fossil fuel, which finally go to a very little minority in all these countries. And energy efficiency and renewable will be competitive, not in all the world, but in, I would say, half the world, Maybe 1 or 2 minutes each one to wrap up and if you want to add a final point before concluding.
Yeah, maybe coming back to the what I said before, not reinventing the wheel. I mean, one example maybe which what we're working on is actually for the European Investment Bank to look at in the MENA region. We're looking at some of the projects that are there that haven't received finance and actually going deeper in to see what it is. And the nice thing to see is that there's many projects that are not funded, but they're not just in energy sector. So we're actually seeing a much broader diversity now also since 10 years back, where it was a lot starting with the energy sector. We see these impacts coming to the other sectors. So I think that is one of the things that we see happening. What we also hear from the people on the ground, though, that there is still there's still a need for capacity building, and that I'm not meaning like capacity on various angles. It's like from the ground, from the project developers, it's like the architects, it's like actually how to use the right technology there. So there's a role for the different players to come in and also do what they're best at, and that is where we have to connect the dots. And then if I just conclude with that, like if we start to connect these dots from the start between stakeholders and technology and finance, then I think we're on a good way to start mainstreaming climate action.
My wife's calling me. You're always supposed to answer your wife when she calls, right? I will call her back later. I can talk to her, yes. So what we do a lot, have done for some time, and I think is our secret to success, is spending time with our clients to educate them on what they need to do and what's possible. And it takes a lot of effort, and we certainly err on the side of spending more time with our clients. And what we find, of course, is the more educated they become on the topic of whether it be the natural gas commodity or a new type of generation like solar or, I mean, you name it, they're willing to do more. They've got confidence to do more. And I think one of the biggest, as much as we love the incentives to help initiate some of these projects, I think if the government had clear policy, which we're getting there on, and global clear policy, which we're getting there, to focus their efforts next, or starting now, on the education side of things, so that the whole world is going to re-educate themselves on what mindset they need to have going forward and how they need to look at the world. I think that's not only will help displacement of people in the coal industry, but it'll help everyone at large. And I think that's if that could be picked up, that would be great.
Katharina?
We strongly believe in multi-stakeholder approaches, so I think it's really important to have everyone at the table. And we try to do that by defining a common language between all these parts engaged in the different project cycle phases or different parts of the world. But what I really think we need to do is to bridge that gap between projects in need of finance, which have to define their own bankability standards, and investors on the other side who are actually looking for projects. So we hope to be of help here by having, put a tool on the table where all these actors can actually use one language and then hopefully make the impact and scale it up by having those dialogues and really finding blended ways of financing.
Okay.
Election.
Well, thank you very much to our three panelists. I think it was a lively workshop and discussion. Thank you to the audience for your question. And I think now we can join together to have a quick lunch or something like that, and see you. We could follow on discussion around the glass. Thank you.